The grand hall of the Valkeran Imperial Palace was designed to inspire awe. Massive columns carved from single pieces of stone rose 50 meters to a vaulted ceiling, painted with battle scenes from 3,000 years of military history. Crystalline chandeliers caught the light in patterns that seemed to shift with the movement of air. Every surface communicated the same message. The Valkeran Empire was ancient, powerful, and not to be trifled with. Commander Erik Hale stood in dress uniform at the center of that magnificent space, acutely aware that thousands of eyes, both physically present and watching via broadcast to coalition space, were watching what came next. 6 months. That's how long the campaign against the Kreth swarm had lasted. 6 months of brutal combat where humanity's tactical innovations had combined with Valkyrian strength to turn what looked like inevitable defeat into hard-won victory. Erik had commanded the coalition task force, coordinating with Valkyrian military leadership in a partnership that had been born from desperation and forged into something more valuable than either side had anticipated. Now came the reward ceremony, a traditional Valkyrian custom that Erik's diplomatic team had briefed him on extensively. The Valkeran Imperial Chancellor, an elderly warrior whose ornaments marked him as one of the Empire's most senior officials, spoke in the formal cadence reserved for state occasions. Commander Erik Hale, your service alongside Valkyrian forces has brought honor to both our peoples. In recognition of your distinguished leadership, the Empire offers you the privilege of bond choice. As is our ancient custom, you may select one Valkyrian warrior to serve as your bond partner, a formal relationship that joins our peoples through ties of honor and mutual respect. Erik had been briefed extensively on what this actually meant. Bond partnership in Valkyrian culture was roughly equivalent to marriage, but with additional layers of martial honor and mutual obligation. It was binding, formal, and carried significant cultural and political weight. 12 Valkyrian women stood in presentation formation on an elevated platform, all volunteers, all warriors of distinction, all carefully selected because their choice would strengthen coalition Valkyrian relations in predictable ways. His advisors had provided detailed files on each candidate. Captain Syra'van, daughter of a powerful military family, choosing her would strengthen ties with the northern provinces. Commander Vexara, decorated officer with extensive diplomatic experience, safe choice that would create no complications. Lieutenant Kesava, young but brilliant tactician, her family controlled significant military resources. Each of the first 11 volunteers represented clear strategic advantages. Strong family connections, useful political alliances, selections that made obvious diplomatic sense. The 12th woman stood slightly apart from the others, and Erik felt his breath catch the moment he saw her. She was Syra'van, first blade of the Valkeran Empire, the most decorated warrior in 3 generations, commander of the legendary Crimson Legion that had held the critical northern front for 2 months against overwhelming odds, while reinforcements were gathered. A woman whose name was spoken with reverence that bordered on religious awe even by battle-hardened Valkyrian soldiers. She was also, objectively, the most beautiful woman Erik had ever seen. The other volunteers were attractive by Valkyrian standards, tall, powerful builds, the distinctive long ears that marked their species elegant and well-adorned. But Syra'van was something else entirely. Perfect symmetry in features that managed to be both fierce and elegant. Long ears adorned not with decorative jewelry but with battle honors, small metallic clasps that marked significant combat achievements. Her build was powerful but moved with grace that suggested deadly efficiency rather than just strength. Her eyes, deep amber that seemed to catch light like polished stone, held the kind of intensity that came from facing death repeatedly and emerging victorious. She stood with absolute confidence, radiating presence that commanded attention without apparent effort. Not arrogance, just the unshakable composure of someone who knew exactly who they were and felt no need to prove it. Erik barely heard the Imperial Chancellor's formal presentations of the first 11 candidates. His attention was fixed on Syra'van, trying to understand why someone so obviously extraordinary was even an option. When the Chancellor reached her, his tone shifted subtly. First Blade Syra'van, greatest warrior of our generation, whose deeds in defense of the Empire are known throughout our territories and beyond. No mention of family connections. Syra'van had risen from common birth through pure combat merit. No discussion of political alliances. Her loyalty was to the Empire itself, not to any specific faction. The implication was clear. She was included because honor demanded it. Her service record made her eligible, but she wasn't meant to be actually selected. She was the untouchable option, the legend you revered from distance but didn't presume to approach. Erik saw something different. He saw exhaustion carefully controlled beneath warrior discipline. He saw someone who'd spent 2 months making impossible decisions that saved thousands of lives at terrible personal cost. He saw isolation, being placed on such a high pedestal that genuine human connection became impossible. He saw the most beautiful and bravest person in the room, and his decision was instant and absolute. Her, Erik said clearly, his voice carrying in the suddenly silent hall. I choose First Blade Syra'van as my bond partner. The silence that followed was so complete that Erik could hear the subtle hum of environmental systems. The Imperial Chancellor's expression shifted to something between shock and horror, as if Erik had just committed a catastrophic breach of protocol. Several of the noble families whose daughters had been passed over looked genuinely offended. Coalition diplomats in the audience appeared to be trying to figure out if this was brilliant strategy or diplomatic disaster. Even the other volunteers seemed stunned, glancing at Syra'van with expressions that mixed awe with disbelief. Syra'van herself showed the first crack in her legendary composure. Her amber eyes widened slightly. Her ears shifted in what Erik's cultural briefing had suggested indicated genuine surprise. For just a moment, the untouchable warrior legend looked human. Well, Valkeran, but vulnerable in a way that made Erik absolutely certain he'd made the right choice. The Chancellor recovered his composure with visible effort. Commander Hale, perhaps you would like to reconsider. The First Blade is certainly worthy of honor, but there are other candidates who might be more appropriate for a formal bond. I've made my choice, Erik said firmly. First Blade Syra'van, if she's willing to accept. All eyes turned to Syra'van, the legendary warrior who'd never shown weakness, never faltered, never appeared as anything less than perfect military discipline. Her voice when she spoke was steady, but Erik heard something beneath it, shock maybe or disbelief. I accept the bond, Commander Hale. The ceremony proceeded with formal documentation, legal proceedings that Erik barely processed. He was too busy watching Syra'van, seeing the way she'd restored her legendary composure but couldn't quite hide the confusion in her eyes. As they left the grand hall together, bond partners now, by ancient Valkeran tradition and formal legal declaration, Erik heard the whispers following them. He actually chose First Blade. Is he brave or insane? No one approaches the legend. She's untouchable, everyone knows. Syra'van walked beside him, not behind in deference, because she was First Blade and deferred to no one, but beside as an equal. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions. Erik's quarters were spacious, designed for an honored guest and their chosen bond partner. After the door closed and they were finally alone, Syra'van turned to face him with an intensity that most people would find intimidating. Why? Her voice was low, controlled, carrying confusion that clearly disturbed her. Why did you choose me? Because you're the most beautiful and bravest woman I've ever encountered, Erik said honestly. Both of those things were immediately obvious. Syra'van stared at him like he'd just spoken in a language her translator couldn't process. That's not how this works. You were supposed to choose based on political advantage, family connections, strategic benefit to coalition interests. Choosing me provides none of those things. I wasn't looking for political advantage, Erik said simply. I was looking at 12 extraordinary women and choosing the one who impressed me most. That was you, obviously. I'm not meant to be chosen, Syra'van said, and there was something raw in her voice, not quite pain, but the echo of isolation that came from being permanently elevated beyond reach. I'm the untouchable option, the legend people revere from distance but don't actually approach. Men admire me, respect me, fear me, they don't choose me. Then men are idiots, Erik said bluntly. You're extraordinary. How could I possibly choose anyone else? And in that moment, watching tears form in the eyes of the Empire's greatest warrior, Erik knew with absolute certainty that he'd made exactly the right choice. Not the safe choice. Not the politically advantageous choice. But the right one. Syra'van stood perfectly still for a long moment, struggling with emotions that clearly weren't part of the First Blade's public persona. When she finally spoke, her voice carried vulnerability that Erik suspected few people ever heard. Do you understand what you've done? What choosing me means? I've chosen the person I found most impressive as my bond partner, Erik said. That seems straightforward. It's not straightforward at all. Syra'van moved to the window overlooking the palace grounds, her back to him. I'm not like the other volunteers. They have families who can benefit from coalition connections. They have political networks that create strategic advantages. They're approachable, normal. I'm the legendary First Blade, Erik finished. Greatest warrior of your generation. The woman who held the Crimson Front for 2 months against impossible odds. I know who you are, Syra'van. That's why I chose you. That's why you shouldn't have chosen me, Syra'van said, turning to face him. Do you know how long it's been since someone looked at me and saw a person rather than a legend? Since someone approached me without fear or excessive reverence? Since someone wanted me rather than wanting proximity to my reputation? How long? Years, maybe a decade. Her legendary composure was cracking, revealing pain beneath. I'm 28 years old. I've been First Blade since I was 23. Before that, I was rising through ranks fast enough that people already treated me as something other than normal. I can't remember the last time someone just talked to me, like I was a person instead of a living symbol. Erik moved closer, careful not to crowd her space. Then they've been failing you badly. You are a person, Syra'van, an extraordinary one, yes, but a person who deserves to be seen and chosen and valued beyond your reputation. You don't understand what you're saying. Being bond partnered to First Blade comes with weight you haven't anticipated. Everyone will see you through the lens of my reputation. You'll be the human who chose the legend forever. People will judge you, question your motives, wonder if you're brave or foolish or playing some angle they haven't figured out yet. Let them wonder, Erik said simply. I chose you because when I looked at 12 options, you were the only one I could imagine actually building a life with. Not because of political calculation or strategic advantage, but because you impressed me. As a warrior, yes, but also as a person who carried impossible weight with dignity and strength. Syra'van's ears shifted in what Erik's briefing materials had indicated was emotional response, surprise or confusion or maybe hope. You saw that, the weight. I saw someone who held a front for 2 months knowing that if it collapsed, thousands would die. Someone who lost soldiers under her command and carried that grief while maintaining discipline that kept others alive. Someone who is fierce and brave and beautiful and probably exhausted in ways that no one acknowledges because legends aren't supposed to get tired. Tears formed in Syra'van's amber eyes, the first genuine emotion beyond controlled warrior discipline that Erik had seen. She blinked them back rapidly, clearly uncomfortable with vulnerability. No one has said anything like that to me in years, she said, voice barely steady. Everyone sees First Blade, the untouchable legend, the warrior who doesn't feel fear or pain or exhaustion. They don't see, she stopped, struggling with words. A woman who is all those impressive things but also just human, well, Valkeran, with normal needs for connection and understanding. Erik suggested gently. Yes, exactly that. Syra'van wiped away tears with a gesture that suggested she was annoyed at herself for showing weakness. You chose me knowing who I am, knowing my reputation, knowing that I'm not the safe or convenient option. Why? Because safe and convenient seemed like terrible criteria for choosing someone to build a partnership with. When I looked at you standing there, I didn't see a political opportunity. I saw the most remarkable person I've ever encountered. Someone I wanted to know, to understand, to stand beside. How could I choose anyone else? Syra'van stared at him for a long moment, and Erik watched decades of isolation crack under the weight of being genuinely seen. I volunteered for the ceremony because my position required it. First Blade couldn't be excluded without insult, but I never imagined anyone would actually choose me. I thought I'd stand there, be acknowledged as the untouchable legend, and then watch you select someone more. Accessible. I don't want accessible, I want you. You don't know me yet. You're choosing based on impression, on legend, on watching you lead during the campaign, Erik interrupted. On seeing how you made decisions, how you treated soldiers under your command, how you balanced impossible tactical requirements with genuine care for lives that depended on your choices. I'm choosing based on 6 months of observing who you actually are when you think no one important is watching. That's not legend, that's reality. Syra'van sat down heavily in one of the chairs, legendary composure completely abandoned. This is going to be complicated. People will judge you for choosing me. They'll question your motives. Some will think you're incredibly brave, others will think you're recklessly naive. Your own diplomatic team probably thinks you've made a mistake. My diplomatic team thinks everything is a mistake unless it fits their political calculations, Erik said. They'll adapt, and I don't particularly care what people think. I care about what I think, and I think I just made the best decision of my life. You can't know that yet. Can't I? I chose to bond with someone extraordinary who everyone else was too intimidated to approach. Someone fierce and brave and real who deserves to be valued as a person rather than just revered as a symbol. That seems pretty clearly correct to me. Syra'van looked up at him with an expression that mixed disbelief with tentative hope. You really mean that? You're not just saying it because the bond is already formalized, and you're trying to make the best of a choice you're already regretting. I'm saying it because it's true, and I'll keep saying it until you believe me. That might take a while. I've spent years being untouchable. Having someone genuinely choose me is difficult to process. Then we'll take the time to process it together, Erik said. No rush. We're bond partners now. We have time to figure out what that means for us specifically, rather than what tradition or expectation says it should mean. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the choice settling between them. Finally, Syra'van spoke again, voice quiet but carrying something that might have been gratitude. Thank you for choosing me, for seeing me as more than the legend, for being willing to deal with all the complications that come with being bond partnered to First Blade. I didn't think anyone would ever do that. Then people have been failing you for a long time, Erik said. But I'm not people. I'm the person who looked at 12 options and chose you without hesitation. Remember that when things get complicated. I will, Syra'van promised. Though I should warn you, things will definitely get complicated. Good, Erik said with a slight smile. Simple is overrated anyway. Over the following weeks, Erik discovered that Syra'van had been absolutely correct about complications. In public, she remained First Blade, legendary warrior, untouchable symbol, the woman whose name was spoken with reverence. Perfect military discipline, absolute composure, the living embodiment of Valkeran martial excellence. In private, Erik gradually met the person beneath the legend. She was not what he'd expected. Not because she was less impressive. If anything, understanding the full complexity of her made her more extraordinary. But because the legend had simplified her into a one-dimensional warrior icon when the reality was far more nuanced. "People think I don't feel fear," she told him one evening as they shared a meal in their quarters, a routine they'd established, eating together after the day's obligations were complete. "They see First Blade, legendary warrior woman who faced the Kreth swarm for 2 months without breaking. They assume I'm fearless." "But you're not," Erik observed, noting the tension in her shoulders that she couldn't quite hide even here. "I'm terrified constantly," Syra'van admitted. "During the Crimson Front campaign, I was afraid every single day. Afraid I'd make the wrong tactical decision. Afraid I'd lose more soldiers than necessary. Afraid the front would collapse and thousands would die because I wasn't good enough, smart enough, strong enough. The fear never stopped. I just didn't let it control my decisions. That's not the same as being fearless." "That's actually braver," Erik said. "Being afraid and functioning anyway, that's courage. Fearlessness is just not understanding the danger." Syra'van looked at him with an expression that might have been gratitude. "No one else understands that distinction. They see my reputation and assume I don't experience normal emotions like fear or doubt. It's isolating, maintaining this image of invincible legend when internally I'm just trying to make good decisions under impossible pressure." Erik also discovered that being bond-partnered to the legendary First Blade came with social complications he hadn't fully anticipated. Other Valkeran treated him with a complex mix of reactions. Some with awe, he was the human who dared choose the untouchable legend. Some with confusion, why would anyone select the most intimidating option? Some with barely concealed judgment, clearly he didn't understand what he'd gotten himself into. At a formal military reception 3 weeks into their bond, a Valkeran general approached Erik with thinly veiled curiosity. "Commander Hale, one must ask, what possessed you to choose First Blade? Surely there were more." "Manageable options." "I wasn't looking for manageable," Erik said calmly. "I was looking for remarkable. Syra'van is the most extraordinary person I've ever encountered. Why would I choose anyone else?" "But surely the complications, her reputation, her status, the expectations, are her problem to manage, not mine to solve," Erik interrupted. "I chose to be her partner, not her handler. If people have complicated feelings about her legendary status, that's something for them to work through, not something that diminishes my choice." The general departed looking unsettled, and Erik noticed Syra'van watching from across the room with an expression he couldn't quite read. Later, back in their quarters, she brought it up. "You defended me to General Kethvan, told him that complications about my reputation were not your concern." "They're not. I chose you, not your reputation." "Though the reputation is impressive," Erik added, "but it's not why I value you." "Then why do you value me?" Syra'van asked, and there was genuine curiosity beneath the question. "We've been bond partners for 3 weeks. You're starting to see the reality beyond the initial impression. What do you actually value now that you're living with the complications?" Erik considered the question seriously. "I value your intelligence, the way you analyze problems and find solutions that aren't obvious. I value your integrity. You do what you believe is right even when it's difficult. I value your humor, which you hide carefully but which emerges when you're comfortable. I value your vulnerability, which you show only in private but which makes you human. Well, Valkeran, rather than just a legendary symbol. I value the way you care deeply while pretending you don't because emotional distance is how you cope with impossible responsibilities." He paused. "I value you as a complete person, not just as the impressive warrior legend. Both parts matter, but you're more than just your reputation." Syra'van's ears shifted in that way that indicated emotional response. "No one has ever said anything like that to me. That they value my vulnerability and complexity, rather than just my strength and achievements." "Then people are fools," Erik said. Your strength is impressive, yes, but your complexity is what makes you interesting. Your vulnerability is what makes you real. I didn't choose a legend to admire from distance. I chose a person to know deeply. Those are different things. His own diplomatic team was less understanding. A month into his bond with Syra'van, his chief diplomatic officer requested a private meeting that was clearly an intervention. "Commander, we need to discuss your bond choice. Choosing First Blade has created complications that we're still managing." "What kind of complications?" Erik asked, though he could guess. "Political ones. By not choosing from the families we recommended, you've potentially offended noble houses whose support we need. By choosing someone with no family connections, you've created no useful alliances. By selecting the most intimidating option, you've made social integration more difficult because everyone is afraid to approach you now." "Afraid to approach me, or afraid to approach Syra'van?" "Both. You're the human who chose the legend now. That's how you're defined in social circles. It's complicated diplomatic navigation unnecessarily." Erik leaned back in his chair, considering his response carefully. "Let me be very clear about something. I didn't choose a bond partner to optimize coalition political positioning. I chose someone I wanted to build a life with. If that creates political complications, then we navigate them. But I'm not going to regret choosing the most extraordinary person I've encountered just because it makes diplomatic calculation more difficult." "But Commander—" "No," Erik interrupted firmly. "I understand your concerns. I appreciate that you're trying to manage coalition interests, but my personal bond partnership is exactly that, personal. I chose Syra'van because she's remarkable and brave and real, and I wanted to stand beside her. That's the entire calculus. Everything else is secondary." The chief diplomat left looking unsatisfied, and Erik knew this wouldn't be the last conversation about his problematic choice. That evening he told Syra'van about the meeting. She listened with her characteristic intensity, then said quietly, "They're right, you know. You could have chosen someone who made your professional life easier. Someone with useful family connections, someone less intimidating, someone who didn't come with the weight of being legendary. You could have made this simpler for yourself." "I could have," Erik agreed, "but simple isn't what I wanted. I wanted you with all the complications, all the legendary reputation, all the weight that comes with being First Blade, because you're worth it. The complications are just complications. They're manageable, you're irreplaceable." Syra'van's eyes filled with tears again. She was crying more often now in private, as if years of suppressed emotion were finally finding release. "Thank you for continuing to choose me even when it would be easier not to. For seeing me as worth the complications. That means more than you probably realize." "It means exactly as much as I intend it to," Erik said, "which is everything." 3 months into their bond partnership, Erik and Syra'van attended a formal military ceremony honoring the heroes of the Crimson Front campaign. Syra'van was the central figure, the warrior who'd held the line, the legend who'd saved thousands, the living symbol of Valkeran martial excellence. Erik watched from the audience as she accepted commendations with perfect military discipline. She looked every bit the untouchable legend, fierce, powerful, absolutely controlled. The crowd watched with reverence that bordered on worship. But Erik saw what others missed. The tension in her shoulders, the careful control of her expression, the way her hands were clenched just slightly behind her back. She was exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. The weight of being legendary, of having thousands project their expectations and reverence onto her, of never being allowed to be just a person. After the ceremony, as they returned to their quarters, Syra'van maintained her perfect composure until the door closed behind them. Then she collapsed into a chair, all the legendary control dropping away. "I hate ceremonies," she said quietly. "Everyone staring at me, seeing First Blade, warrior legend, living symbol. No one seeing Syra'van who is tired and sad about soldiers I lost and uncomfortable with being celebrated for survival when others died. Then don't attend the next one, Erik suggested. Syra'van looked at him like he'd just suggested something impossible. I can't refuse. I'm First Blade. My presence is required for morale, for symbolism, for other people's needs, Erik interrupted gently. But what about your needs? You held that front for 2 months, Syra'van. You've earned the right to decline ceremonies that cause you pain. That's not how it works. The legend has obligations. The person has limits, Erik countered. And maybe it's time the Empire learned that even legendary warriors are allowed to be human. Well, Valkeran, you can be both First Blade and someone who finds ceremonies painful. Both things can be true simultaneously. Syra'van stared at him with an expression that shifted from disbelief to tentative hope. You genuinely think I should prioritize my well-being over maintaining the legend's image? Absolutely. The legend exists to serve the Empire. But you're also a person who deserves to exist beyond service. You're allowed to have limits, to need rest, to decline obligations that are harmful to your mental health. That doesn't diminish your achievements. It just acknowledges that you're a complete person rather than a one-dimensional symbol. It was a conversation that continued over weeks, gradually shifting how Syra'van thought about herself and her role. Not abandoning her responsibilities or her position as First Blade, but acknowledging that she was allowed to be a complete person with needs and limits rather than a symbol that existed solely for others. Erik also faced his own adjustments to being bond-partnered to a living legend. There were social events where people couldn't see past Syra'van's reputation to acknowledge him as anything but the human who chose First Blade. There were moments where her fame overshadowed everything else about their relationship. There were complicated navigations of how to be supportive without being overshadowed, how to have his own identity while being known primarily through his connection to her. But there were also private moments where the legend dropped away entirely, and he was just with Syra'van, brilliant, fierce, vulnerable, funny, real. One evening, 6 months into their bond, they sat together on the balcony of their quarters watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that had no names in either of their languages. "Thank you," Syra'van said quietly. "For what?" "For choosing me. For continuing to choose me every day despite complications. For seeing me as more than legend. For understanding that I'm both the warrior who held the Crimson Front and the woman who still has nightmares about soldiers who died under my command. For being the first person in years who wanted me rather than wanting proximity to the legend." "Thank you for being exactly who you are," Erik replied. "For being fierce and brave and real. For letting me see beyond the legend to the extraordinary person underneath. For trusting me enough to show vulnerability that you hide from everyone else." "Do you regret it?" Syra'van asked, and there was uncertainty beneath the question. Choosing the most complicated option, dealing with all the social dynamics and political complications, and the weight of being bond-partnered to First Blade. "Not for a single moment," Erik said firmly. "I chose the most beautiful and bravest woman I'd ever encountered. Every day since has confirmed that was exactly the right choice. The complications are just complications. They're manageable. You're irreplaceable." Syra'van leaned against him, and Erik felt the weight of legendary reputation settle into simple human, Valkeran contact. "I chose you too," she said quietly. "That first day in the Grand Hall, when you pointed at me without hesitation, I chose to accept. Not because tradition required it, but because something in how you looked at me suggested you saw me as a person rather than just a legend. I chose to hope that maybe, finally, someone would value me for who I actually am." "I do value you," Erik said. "Exactly as you are, legend and person both, the fierce independence and the hidden vulnerability, the public strength and the private struggles, all of it. That's what I chose, and I'd choose it again without hesitation." A year into their bond partnership, Erik was formally offered a permanent position, coordinating Coalition Valkeran military cooperation. It was a role that would keep him in Valkeran space indefinitely, working closely with their command structure, and essentially making his choice to stay with Syra'van official on a professional level as well. "I want you to take it," Syra'van told him when he expressed concern about how it might affect their partnership. "This work matters to both our peoples, and selfishly I want you here. Not because duty requires it or because the bond obligates you, but because I choose you just as deliberately as you chose me. I chose the most beautiful and bravest woman I'd ever encountered," Erik said. "The legendary first blade that everyone revered but no one dared approach. Every day since has proven that was the right choice. I chose the human who looked at 12 options and fearlessly selected the untouchable legend everyone else was too intimidated to approach," Syra'van responded. "Who saw past reputation to the person beneath. Who understood that being a living legend doesn't mean you stop being human. Well, Valkeran, with normal needs for connection and understanding. Who made me believe that maybe I deserve to be chosen as myself, not just revered as a symbol." "You did deserve that," Erik said. "You deserved it long before I showed up. I just happened to be the first person brave enough, or naive enough, to actually choose you. Best decision I ever made." Years later, when people told the story, they focused on the dramatic moment. The human commander who shocked the Valkeran court by choosing the legendary first blade everyone revered, but no one dared approach. They talked about his fearless decisiveness, his refusal to calculate politically, his bold selection of the most beautiful and bravest option when everyone expected him to choose safely. But for Erik and Syra'van, the real story was what came after that moment. The gradual building of genuine partnership between a living legend learning she was allowed to be human, and a human who'd never seen the legend as anything but a person who deserved to be chosen, admired, and loved for